In 1944, Elinor Powell became one of only 300 black nurses allowed in the U.S. Army. She was ready to save American lives. But when she arrived at her assignment, she got devastating news. She was banned from treating white American soldiers. Instead, she was assigned to care for Nazi prisoners of war, the very men fighting to destroy America. But what happened next? No one could have predicted. And by the end of this story, you'll discover why this forbidden relationship wasn't just about love. It was about revenge, rebellion, and a secret plan so bold it would change everything. Stay with me. Picture this: a black American nurse standing face to face with a German soldier in the middle of World War II. But instead of hatred, something impossible happened between them. This wasn't supposed to be a love story. In fact, their relationship broke so many rules that both could have ended up behind bars. She was forbidden from treating her own countrymen, but forced to care for captured enemies. He wore the uniform of a regime built on hate. And yet, in the scorching Arizona desert of 1944, they found something that neither America nor Nazi Germany could accept. But here's what you need to know right now. Before this story is over, you're going to hear about a plan so desperate, so calculated, that it would either reunite them or destroy them both. Keep watching to find out what they did. In 1947, Elinor Powell would stand in a New York courthouse, pregnant and unmarried, waiting for a man who might never come back. A man she'd only known for 18 months. A man who was technically still her enemy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how she got there, we need to go back to the beginning. Elinor Powell grew up believing in the American dream. Born in 1921 in Milton, Massachusetts, she came from a family that had every reason to be proud. Her grandmother had freed herself from the chains of slavery, traveling north along the Underground Railroad to build a new life. Her father wore the uniform in the Great War, serving his country with honor. Elinor grew up in what people called a progressive suburb outside Boston, attending white schools and making white friends. For a black family in the 1920s and 30s, this was extraordinary. She lived in a bubble where racism felt like something that happened elsewhere, to other people. Her childhood was comfortable, even privileged by the standards of the time. Everything in her life prepared her to be a hero. What she didn't know was that her own country would treat her like the enemy. So when she decided to follow her father's footsteps and enlist in the Army Nurse Corps in 1944, she thought she knew what she was signing up for. She imagined herself on the front lines in Europe, tending to wounded American heroes, making a real difference in the war effort. She had no idea that her country was about to betray her in the worst way possible. And that betrayal? It would lead her straight into the arms of a man who should have been her mortal enemy. The wake-up call came fast. Elinor completed her basic training at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, about an hour outside Tucson. This wasn't just any military base. It had become the largest installation for black soldiers and nurses in the entire country. The Army Nurse Corps had 40,000 white nurses serving across the globe, but for black women, they allowed exactly 300. That's it. 300 black nurses for the entire war effort, even though thousands of qualified black women were desperately trying to enlist. Even though there was a massive nursing shortage. Even though President Roosevelt threatened to draft nurses because they needed them so badly. The military simply didn't want black women in uniform, and they made that crystal clear. But Elinor and her fellow nurses thought they'd proven themselves. They'd made it through training. Surely now they'd get their chance to serve on the real battlefields. Want to know what happened instead? You won't believe this. The news hit like a slap across the face. Elinor and the other black nurses weren't being sent to care for wounded American soldiers. They were being shipped to Camp Florence, a prisoner of war camp in the Arizona desert, to tend to captured German soldiers, Nazi prisoners, men who had been fighting to destroy everything America claimed to stand for. The reason? Army officials explained it with shocking honesty. There had been too much fraternization between white nurses and the German POWs. White women were getting too friendly with the enemy. So the solution was simple: replace them with black nurses. The assumption was that black women and white German prisoners would never be attracted to each other. Problem solved. They were wrong, dead wrong, and what happened next would shock everyone involved. The black nurses couldn't believe what they were hearing. Letters from that time reveal their shock and anger. They'd trained to save American lives on the front lines. Instead, they were being used as a punishment detail, banished to the desert to care for the very men trying to destroy their country. And the insult cut even deeper than that. The racism Elinor encountered in Arizona was brutal and constant. She walked into a Woolworth's lunch counter in downtown Phoenix, wearing her Army officer's uniform, and the waiter refused to serve her. She was a commissioned officer in the United States military during wartime, and she couldn't get a meal at a counter. Meanwhile, the German prisoners she was assigned to care for, they could walk into those same restaurants with their American guards and eat without any problems. Nazi soldiers had more rights in America than a black American Army officer. Let that sink in for a moment. The enemy had more rights than she did. German POWs were treated better than a black American officer serving her country. Some of the German POWs were just as shocked as the black nurses. Many of them had never traveled to America before, had never encountered black people back home. They couldn't understand why the country that was supposedly fighting for freedom and democracy treated its own citizens worse than enemy prisoners. But not all the Germans were sympathetic. Some of them made their views very clear. One POW hurled racial slurs at Elinor. The Army officers did nothing. No punishment, no consequences. After all, he was white and she wasn't, and that seemed to be all that mattered. Elinor stayed angry throughout most of her assignment. The whole experience was maddening, frustrating, insulting. But then, in that place of hate and injustice, she met someone who would change everything. And when he first spoke to her, his words were so bold, so impossible, that she thought he'd lost his mind. Frederick Albert wasn't supposed to be different from the other prisoners. Born in 1925 in Oppeln, Germany, to a wealthy upper-middle-class family in Vienna, he grew up in a household that believed in German nationalism. His family didn't join the Nazi Party, but they supported Hitler and the idea of a German empire. Frederick, though, was different. He was an artist at heart, a sensitive soul in a time when sensitivity was seen as weakness. His father was distant and cold, an engineer who had served in the First War and had little interest in his children. Frederick desperately wanted his father's approval, so he did what he thought would earn it. He volunteered for the paratroopers. But the war wasn't what he'd imagined. While stationed in Italy, he was captured by Allied forces and shipped across the ocean to a prison camp in the Arizona desert. At Camp Florence, his skills as a cook and baker earned him a job in the mess hall. He was talented in the kitchen, and the camp put those talents to use. And then one day, everything changed. A group of nurses walked in for their meal. Frederick spotted Elinor across the room. Later, he would say it felt like being under a spell, like time stopped, like nothing else in the world mattered. Without hesitation, without thinking about the impossible odds, he walked straight up to this black American nurse, looked her in the eye, and said the words that would seal both their fates. "You should know my name. I'm the man who's going to marry you." Can you imagine? A Nazi prisoner of war telling a black American Army officer that he's going to marry her? In 1944 Arizona, where interracial relationships were illegal, where dating an enemy POW could get her court-martialed and thrown in military prison. Elinor thought he'd lost his mind. She should have walked away. She should have reported him, but she didn't. And what happened over the next few weeks would lead to a secret so dangerous it could have destroyed both their lives. Frederick didn't give up. Over the next few weeks, he started bringing her treats from the camp kitchen, little gifts made with his own hands. They started talking, really talking, and Elinor discovered something that shook her understanding of everything. Frederick loved jazz music. Back in Germany, Hitler had banned it, called it degenerate. But Frederick had sneaked around, listening to it in secret, fascinated by the artistry and emotion of Black American musicians. He saw African Americans not as inferior, but as the embodiment of everything he felt his own rigid family life lacked: warmth, creativity, freedom of expression. He'd grown up feeling like an outsider in his own home, never measuring up to his father's expectations. And here was Elinor, who, despite her uniform and her service, was treated as an outsider by her own country. Two people, both rejected by their own families, both wearing uniforms they didn't fully believe in, both treated as outsiders. They found in each other what the world refused to give them: acceptance. The relationship deepened in secret. For over a year, they carried on a forbidden romance right under everyone's noses. They'd sneak away to quiet stairwells for stolen kisses. They'd find moments alone whenever they could. Elinor's fellow nurses knew what was happening, but they kept the secret. They understood that if the army found out, Elinor's career would be over. She could face serious prison time. And Frederick? Well, POWs who got involved with American women didn't exactly have a good time of it either. But they couldn't stop. The love between them was real, deeper than the uniforms they wore or the rules they were breaking. But the war wasn't going to last forever. And when it ended, they'd be ripped apart. Unless they did something unthinkable. While the world around them was consumed by hate, they found something pure. It didn't make sense to anyone on the outside. A Black woman from Massachusetts and a German soldier from Vienna. She was caring for prisoners from an army that represented the ultimate expression of white supremacy. He was part of a military machine that had tried to conquer Europe. And yet somehow, impossibly, they made each other whole. But time was running out. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For most people, this was cause for celebration. For Elinor and Frederick, this wasn't celebration. This was the end of everything. All German POWs were being deported back to their home country. Frederick would be shipped back to Germany, likely never to return. They'd be separated by an ocean, by laws, by everything that made their relationship impossible in the first place. Most couples would have accepted defeat. Most people would have said goodbye and moved on with their lives. But Elinor and Frederick weren't most people. They came up with a plan so bold, so calculated, so desperate that if it failed, they'd lose everything. And if it succeeded, well, they'd still face a lifetime of struggle. Here's what they did. Before Frederick was deported, they made a decision that would either reunite them or destroy Elinor's life forever. They conceived a child together. It was strategic. It was calculated. It was their only chance. If Elinor was pregnant with Frederick's baby, he'd have a legal claim to return to the United States. He'd have a child on American soil, and that would give him grounds for a visa. Think about what this meant. Elinor would return home to Massachusetts, alone, unmarried, pregnant with a German POW's baby. In 1946, the scandal would be overwhelming. Her family would be shocked. Her community would judge her. She could lose everything, but it was their only chance. So in April 1946, Frederick was deported to Germany, and Elinor went home to face the consequences alone. pregnant, waiting, hoping, praying that their plan would work. Her family must have been shocked. Her mother had to help her through this. The scandal of it all must have been overwhelming. But their plan worked. A year later, in 1947, Frederick obtained sponsorship and returned to America. After more than a year apart, after all the uncertainty, after all the judgment, they were finally together. The couple didn't waste any time. They got married in New York, one of the few states where interracial marriage was actually legal. This was 1947. The Loving versus Virginia decision that would finally strike down all laws banning interracial marriage nationwide wouldn't come until 1967, 20 years later. Elinor and Frederick were pioneers, whether they wanted to be or not. But getting married was just the beginning of their nightmare, because America had other plans for them. They quickly discovered that legal didn't mean accepted. They tried to settle down in Boston, close to Elinor's family. It should have been straightforward. Instead, it became a nightmare. Landlords kept evicting them. Some objected to having an ex-Nazi soldier living in their building. Others simply refused to rent to an interracial couple. It didn't matter that Frederick had been a cook, not a soldier on the front lines. It didn't matter that he'd never believed in Nazi ideology. All people saw was his German background and the color of Elinor's skin, and that was enough. After months of rejection, they made a drastic decision. They'd move to Germany. Frederick's father had a brick-making business in Göttingen. Frederick could work there, make a decent living. Maybe in his home country, things would be different. Maybe they'd finally find acceptance. Germany was worse. So much worse. Göttingen was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Frederick's mother made her feelings about having a black daughter-in-law abundantly clear. She wasn't subtle about her racism. Family gatherings became tense, uncomfortable affairs. Kids in the neighborhood would ask cruel questions. Why was there a black woman living with them? Why were Frederick and Elinor's children a different color? Frederick's niece, Christina, later remembered seeing Elinor crying alone in the kitchen, overwhelmed by the constant hostility. This was supposed to be Frederick's homeland, the place where his family had status and respect. Instead, it was just another place that rejected them. After less than 2 years, they packed up their belongings and their young son, Stephen, and returned to America. They were homeless in the truest sense. Neither country wanted them. Neither society would accept them. But they had each other, and they had their children, and somehow that had to be enough. Back in the United States, they tried the Philadelphia suburbs. They found a place to live and started trying to build a normal life. Then it came time to enroll Stephen in school. They wanted him to attend the local elementary school in their district. The school officials refused. They were told, in no uncertain terms, to take their son to the black school across town. Never mind that they lived in this district. Never mind that they paid taxes. The color of Elinor's skin and the mixed-race status of their child meant he wasn't welcome at the white school. The couple had to get the NAACP involved just to fight for their son's right to attend his neighborhood school. The civil rights organization had to intervene to desegregate one school for one child in the 1950s. It was exhausting, it was humiliating, and it was constant. They moved from town to town, always searching, never finding home, until finally they discovered a place that would change everything. Every time they tried to settle down, every time they thought they'd found a place to call home, they ran into the same walls of hatred and ignorance. They moved from town to town, always searching, never quite finding what they needed. Their second son, Chris, was born during these wandering years. The boys grew up watching their parents face rejection over and over again, but they also grew up watching their parents refuse to give up on each other. And that lesson, That model of love, persevering despite impossible odds, shaped who they became. Finally, in South Norwalk, Connecticut, they found what they'd been searching for. Village Creek was different from everywhere else they'd tried. This community had been intentionally designed as an integrated neighborhood. The covenants actually advertised it as a prejudice-free zone. People of different races could live side by side without fear. For the first time since they'd gotten married, Elinor and Frederick could just breathe. Frederick put his cooking skills to work and landed a job at Pepperidge Farm, the baking company. He wasn't just some guy on the line. His talents were recognized, and he worked his way up until he became vice president, in charge of the experimental kitchen. He was creating new products, innovating, using the skills that had first brought him and Elinor together back at that mess hall in Arizona. They raised their sons in that Connecticut home. Stephen and Chris grew up in a household filled with jazz music, the sound that had first connected their father to Black American culture. The music that had been banned in Nazi Germany was the soundtrack to their family life. Chris inherited his parents' love of jazz and became an accomplished trumpet player, eventually joining the Duke Ellington Orchestra. The son of a black nurse and a German POW, playing the music that had once been considered degenerate by one regime and created by people considered second-class citizens in another country, made it to one of the most prestigious jazz ensembles in the world. And Frederick and Elinor, they stayed together for the rest of their lives. But here's the part that will break your heart. Frederick and Elinor stayed in that Connecticut home for the rest of their lives. They'd finally found their place, their community, the acceptance that had been denied to them for so long. Frederick passed away in 2001 at the age of 75. Elinor followed him 4 years later in 2005, passing at age 84. Their son Chris said something beautiful about his parents after they were gone. He said they loved each other deeply until the very end. Through all the struggles, all the rejection, all the times the world told them their love was wrong, they never stopped loving each other. And here's what you need to understand. This story isn't ancient history. For decades, their story remained largely unknown. It was a family history, shared quietly but not widely publicized. Then journalist Alexis stumbled upon a brief mention of Elinor Powell in a book about World War II nurses. One sentence said she'd met and married a German prisoner of war in Arizona. Clark couldn't let it go. She had to know more. Through years of research and interviews, she pieced together the full story. In 2018, she published Enemies in Love, bringing Elinor and Frederick's romance to light for the first time. The book revealed not just a love story, but a hidden history of race in America during World War II that most people had never heard about. This story forces us to face something uncomfortable. Black nurses were barred from treating white American soldiers, but forced to care for captured Nazis. German prisoners of war had more freedom and better treatment than Black American soldiers fighting for their own country. The military that was supposedly defending freedom and democracy overseas was enforcing rigid segregation and racism at home. And in the middle of all that hypocrisy, two people refused to let hate win. Think about what they did. Elinor and Frederick's love wasn't just a romance. It was an act of rebellion. They broke laws. They defied social norms. They conceived a child as a strategic move to stay together. They endured rejection in 2 countries, faced hatred from both their families at different times, and kept moving forward anyway. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for society to catch up. The Loving versus Virginia decision that would make interracial marriage legal nationwide came in 1967, but they got married in 1947. They were living the reality of mixed-race love 20 years before the Supreme Court said it was okay. They were pioneers who never asked for that role. What makes their story even more powerful is what it reveals about the human capacity for connection. Frederick was raised in a family that supported Hitler's vision for Germany. He could have absorbed all that ideology, could have believed in white supremacy and racial hierarchies. Instead, he rejected it. He saw past the propaganda to recognize the humanity and artistry of Black Americans through their music. And when he met Elinor, he saw her as a person, not as something less than human the way he'd been taught. Elinor had every reason to hate Germans. She was forced to care for prisoners from an army that represented the most extreme form of racism the world had ever seen. Some of those prisoners treated her terribly, used slurs against her, reminded her that even as a prisoner, they thought they were better than her. But she saw past Frederick's uniform to the person underneath. She recognized that he was as much a victim of his circumstances as she was of hers. They both wore uniforms they didn't fully believe in. They both served systems that rejected them for who they really were. And in finding each other, they found freedom. And here's the most powerful part, the part that makes this story truly unforgettable. The irony runs deep. America was fighting a war against Nazi Germany, claiming moral superiority, saying they were defending freedom and equality. Meanwhile, Black Americans couldn't vote in much of the country, couldn't eat at the same lunch counters, couldn't marry who they loved, and were treated as second-class citizens in the military they volunteered to join. Nazi Germany built its entire ideology on racial purity and white supremacy. But when it came down to it, a German soldier was capable of seeing past race to love a Black woman, while America couldn't even let Black nurses treat white patients. The contradictions are staggering. Both nations failed these two people. Both systems of oppression tried to keep them apart, and both were defeated by something stronger than laws or ideology: human connection. Love didn't fix the racism they faced. It didn't make the discrimination go away, but it gave them something to hold on to when everything else was trying to tear them apart. It gave them a reason to keep fighting, keep moving, keep searching for a place where they could just exist without being under attack. And eventually, they found it. A place to call home, a community that accepted them, a life together. Today, their story serves as a reminder of how far we've come and how recently these battles were fought. It's easy to think of the 1940s and 50s as ancient history, but Elinor and Frederick's sons are still alive. Chris Albert has shared his parents' story in interviews and documentaries. The discrimination his parents faced, the struggle to find a place to live, the fight to enroll him in school, these aren't distant memories. They happened within living memory. And while we've made progress, the fundamental questions their story raises are still relevant. How do we treat people who are different from us? Do we let fear and prejudice dictate who can love whom? Do we judge people by their uniform and their background, or do we take the time to see who they really are underneath? Elinor and Frederick answered those questions with their lives. They chose love over fear. They chose connection over tribalism. They chose each other over the approval of their countries, their families, and their communities. And in doing so, they created something beautiful. A family filled with music and love. Children who grew up to make their own contributions to the world. A legacy that outlasted all the hatred directed at them. So the next time you hear someone say, "Love conquers all," remember, it's not just a pretty phrase. For Elinor Powell and Frederick Albert, it was a daily battle. Love didn't conquer easily. It conquered slowly, painfully, through years of rejection and struggle and tears cried alone in kitchens in foreign countries. But it conquered. They won. Not because the world changed for them, though eventually it did start to change. They won because they refused to let the world's hatred change them. They held on to each other when that was all they had. And here's the question this story leaves us with. Would you have that kind of courage? Would you risk everything, your career, your family, your community, your freedom, for love? Elinor and Frederick did. They conceived a child as a strategic move. They endured rejection in 2 countries. They moved from place to place, always searching. They fought for decades just to exist together. And in the end, isn't that what real love is? Not the fairy tale version where everything works out perfectly, but the messy, complicated, difficult version where you fight for each other every single day because the alternative, living without that person, is simply unthinkable. That's the love story of the nurse and the enemy soldier. It's not the love story anyone expected. It's not the one either of them probably imagined for themselves. But it's the one they lived. And it's one worth remembering, because it shows us that even in the darkest times, even when nations are at war and hatred seems to rule the world, love can still find a way.